Okay, so metabolic pathways. So metabolism is what your body does. It's what your cells do, and it's breaking bonds and combining bonds together. You're metabolizing, so you're metabolizing glucose. You're turning it into energy, and then you're using that energy to create more new cells, so that you can reproduce. Essentially, there you go. That's life. That's your life. That's your life, kid. You eat sugar to make babies. That's it. To grow and make babies. That's it. That's life. So we have these things called metabolic pathways, and each step. How do enzymes play into this? Well, each step of a metabolic pathway has an enzyme doing something, breaking bonds, combining bonds together. Enzymes at every step. That's how important enzymes are. Now, so your body has broken down, metabolic pathway has, so you start with something and you come up with a result at the end of a metabolic pathway. Now, there's probably a way to go from here to here in one step. The problem is you don't have a lot of control over that, and it would probably either use up too much energy or release too much energy. If you break it down into little steps, you can control this metabolic pathway, and you can consume that energy, if it's releasing energy, in little bits, so that it doesn't get overwhelmed. It's basically, metabolic pathways are a way of staying out of fire. So let's talk about a very important metabolic pathway, the most important metabolic pathway, and that is how do our bodies produce energy. So cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is the process of breaking down biomolecules into energy, into ATP, so that we can have energy to do things that we do. And remember, we talked about ATP when we talked about it in A5 or something, the RNA bit. We talked about ATP being, basically ATP is the currency of energy in the cell, because when you break that bond, that high energy that covalent bond that holds the last phosphate group, you release heat. And remember, what heat does is heat provides that activation energy. It makes molecules move. So a little bit of heat, and these molecules move. They have more kinetic energy so that a reaction can occur, and so that the enzyme, that activation energy for this enzyme, can put these. If it's too cold here, it can't move. It's too cold. It can't overcome the electrochemical forces here that are maybe keeping these two things apart. But if there's a little bit of heat, these things can move more and put things together. That's what ATP does. So there would be an ATP here, like an ATP molecule here, basically near this enzyme, and it would be like the bond breaks. There's another enzyme that breaks that bond, and heat is released here so that this enzyme can do its job. That's essentially what happens. That's what you imagine is happening in our bodies. So how do we generate that ATP so we can have the energy to do all those other things? Well, so cellular respiration, we can take proteins, we can take lipids, and we can break them down and turn them into ATP. Okay, that's cellular respiration. And even nucleic acids. When we do that, by the way, we produce something very toxic. We produce ammonia, which is why you need your whole urinary system. When we talk about the urinary system, that is the product of metabolism of proteins, of amino acids, and nucleic acids. Let's talk about sugar, though. Sugar is the main, sort of the big story. We all want sugar, right? Your body is so tuned to consuming sugar. When we digest, the first thing we digest are starches, which are carbohydrates, which are sugars. In our mouth, that's the first thing. Give us that sugar. We evolved for sugar because sugar has the greatest punch. It's the easiest to break down and turn into ATP. You're getting the greatest net amount of ATP from breaking down sugar. And the breakdown of sugar, so carbohydrate metabolism, occurs in two phases. There's two steps. The first one is called glycolysis, okay? And we don't have to worry about, there's an image here of glycolysis in the notes. You don't have to worry about all the steps of glycolysis. What you do have to know is that where glycolysis occurs and in what kind of cells does glycolysis occur. So glycolysis is the first half of cellular respiration or of sugar carbohydrate metabolism. And what happens in glycolysis is you use some ATP and you get some ATP back, and the net amount of ATP that you get from glycolysis is 2. You get 2 ATP. You also get 2 3-carbon sugars called pyruvates, these 3 pyruvates, okay? It's very important. Glycolysis, all cells on Earth can do glycolysis. So that means bacteria do glycolysis. And our cells are also doing glycolysis. When you eat sugar, when you win one of our Kahoots and you get a candy bar from me and there's sugar in it, your body will take that glucose and it will do glycolysis, and you'll end up with some pyruvates and 2 ATP. Now, we're what's called eukaryotic cells. And eukaryotic cells are different from prokaryotic cells, which are bacteria. Prokaryotic cells is that we have organelles. We have basically structures inside. We're going to be learning about that in the cell unit coming up soon. Held in by membranes. And one of the organelles that we have is called mitochondria, which is called the powerhouse of the cell. And the reason it's called the powerhouse of the cell is because, so eukaryotes, we don't finish at glycolysis. We continue on. We take those 3-carbon sugars, those pyruvates, and they enter the mitochondria, and there they undergo the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. And they're basically broken down further. Now, in order for the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain to occur, you need oxygen. That is why you breathe, is for cellular respiration, for the thing that happens inside your mitochondria. That oxygen that you breathe in with every single breath goes into your mitochondria, and electrons get transferred onto it, and blah, 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 blah. Bonds get broken, blah, blah, blah. And the net product, the net effect of the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain of those 2 pyruvates is 36 additional ATP. So just think about that for a second. Take a moment to think about that. Prokaryotes, bacteria, from one sugar molecule, one glucose, produce 2 ATP. You, from one sugar molecule, produce 2 ATP through glycolysis and then 36 ATP through Krebs cycle. What are we going to call this? Well, cellular respiration. I guess it's correct. Call it cellular. The whole thing is cellular respiration. So a total of 38 ATP. So for each sugar molecule, you are making 38 ATP versus 2 for bacteria. No wonder you can grow to be, you have so much more energy with each sugar. We can be big and move and be giant, and our cells can specialize, and we can think, and we can murder bacteria with antibiotics. We can do all those things because we have so much more energy per unit of sugar, per monomer of sugar. That's why we're amazing. Eukaryotes are incredible. We're amazing. Amazing. But okay, so glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm. It happens outside of the mitochondria. You produce 2 ATP and those pyruvates. Then those pyruvates go in. They further the turn like acetic acid. And then 36 more ATP. So eukaryotes produce 38 ATP for each unit of glucose. Prokaryotes, bacteria, produce only 2. That's an important thing to know. Now, sometimes you don't have enough oxygen. Sometimes you are running and all your mitochondria are firing. Blah, 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 they're using up the oxygen. So the product of cellular respiration, not only is it 36 ATP, but it's also carbon dioxide, which you breathe out and is toxic, and water. That's where that oxygen that you breathe in goes. It goes to make carbon dioxide and water. it participates in those O's that are in H2O and CO2, and you breathe those out. You actually are breathing out water as well. And I could prove it to you if it was cool enough in here. If I had a cool cup, it's so hot, you would breathe on it and you could see the water condensing on the cup. That's the water that's the oxygen that I breathed in. That's the proof that I'm doing cellular respiration. Now, sometimes you're running, you don't get enough oxygen. You're not breathing enough oxygen. And your muscle cells can actually do something called fermentation. They can ferment. They can operate with the absence of oxygen. So your mitochondria can't do cellular respiration. So instead, what happens is you just do that first part. You do that glycolysis part. So you're burning sugar and you're producing 2 ATP, but hey, it's enough to get your muscles moving. You're gonna have a deficit. You're gonna have a problem. And then you produce those 3 carbon sugar things, those pyruvates. However, those then are converted to lactic acid. And some of you, if you've exercised, may have experienced what happens when you produce lactic acid, right? You can get a stitch if you're running. That's the lactic acid building up in your diaphragm and causing it to spasm. So lactic acid is bad. It's bad to have an acid. And you get sore muscles. They get damaged. So not only do the tendons get pulled, but your muscles are sore. And that's probably due to the lactic acid that builds up in your muscles when you work out and you're not getting enough oxygen in there fast enough. Your circulatory system is not bringing oxygen fast enough. You're producing lactic acid. And then what animals do, we actually, because our demands for metabolism are so high, we do not waste a single ATP. So what we do is the lactic acid builds up in your muscles, but then once you slow down and you're getting enough oxygen in, your body will convert that lactic acid back into pyruvate and acetic acid, and it will carry out cellular respiration in the mitochondria and produce those 36 ATP. Those will not be wasted. So you will turn that lactic acid eventually into those 36 ATP. Plants can also ferment. However, plants, their lives are so much simpler than ours. They just sit there. They don't have to move. So plants can ferment. You can put plants inside, seal them up in a container that doesn't let air in, and they will switch. Plants are eukaryotic, so they have mitochondria. They make their own sugar. That's what chloroplasts are for. So they will make their own sugar and they will metabolize that into energy in their mitochondria. But they also can do glycolysis and produce those 2 ATP, except plants. So then what happens is at the end of glycolysis, you have those 3 carbon sugars. And instead of those going into mitochondria, if plants don't have enough oxygen, what they will do is they will convert it into ethanol, those pyruvates. And you guys are too young to experience the effects of ethanol, but maybe your parents at a special occasion let you sample some wine, and the alcohol in that wine, that's where it comes from. It comes from fermentation of grapes. So grapes are in these vats that don't get enough oxygen, and what they do is they will produce ethanol, produce an alcohol. Wine, that's how you make wine. You starve grapes of oxygen so that they cannot carry out cellular respiration in their mitochondria. They cannot do the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. That's fermentation in plants. Ethanol, it's not reversible. In plants, it's not reversible. They'll waste it because plants make their own food. They don't have to move. Their metabolism is like bleh. So they can waste it. They'll just produce a whole bunch of booze and get animals boozy. So animals can get boozy, and then, I don't know, the animals will be, when they're boozy, they will, I don't know, get oxygen to the plants. Who knows? I don't know what plants are controlling us. Plants are controlling us. So, and then each step of this process, all of this metabolism. In fact, if you look at the notes, I can bring them over here. I mean, there's so there is glycolysis. There's those 3 carbon. So that's the sugars. There's the sugar. And it gets converted and broken down into these 3 carbons. Then it goes into the mitochondria to produce 36 ATP. Here you've got the net is 2 ATP. You'll notice here is NAD plus NADH. That's a vitamin. So you need vitamins in order to be able to carry out glycolysis. You need vitamin B. I believe that's vitamin B to carry that out. And what that vitamin is doing is basically it's allowing electrons to be transferred in this process, letting an enzyme do that. And enzymes are every part of this metabolic process. So when you hear metabolism, just know that that's enzymes carrying out each little step of a metabolic pathway. Okay. I think I've covered what I wanted to cover.